Okay, everybody, good afternoon and welcome to the UCCS Speaker Series once again. I'm Richard Kravitz. I'm the director of UC Center Sacramento. It's a pleasure to have you all here. This is the sixth talk of our fall season and the second to deal with housing. Kelly Turner's talk on creating solutions within homes to deal with extreme heat was the first. But this is the first to take a futurist, long-term perspective on California's ongoing housing problem. And to many observers, perhaps all observers, the problem is getting worse. Supply is down relative to need. To borrow a meme from Broadway, the rent is too damn high. The homelessness problem, which we'll tackle in some detail in winter quarter, during our UCCS Winter Symposium on Chronic Homelessness, is growing before our very eyes. If we look back, we see lots of small decisions that have led to big problems. Too little building, too much red tape, too little will, too much NIMBYism. But today we look to the future. Carolina Reed led a team for the California 100 project that examined how California might adopt policies leading to a better housing future in 2030 and 2080 and beyond. For those of you who don't know, California 100 is a statewide research effort to envision a better future for California in 15 policy areas over the next 100 years. Dr. Reed is Associate Professor of City and Regional Planning and the I. Donald Turner Distinguished Professor at UC Berkeley. Her extensive research portfolio focuses on housing and community development, with a special emphasis on access to credit, housing and mortgage markets, urban poverty, and racial inequality. She's published widely in the academic literature, and her work has been covered in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and NPR. After earning a PhD in human geography at the University of Washington in Seattle, she spent some time working at the Center for Responsible Lending and later at the Federal Reserve in San Francisco, and then came on to join the faculty at UC Berkeley. Well, UCCS is able to bring you these presentations with the support of the University of California and its 10 campuses, but we're also grateful to have had a number of organizational and private sponsors. Today, we gratefully acknowledge the co-sponsorship of the Center for California Real Estate, an affiliate of the California Association of Realtors. CCRE also co-sponsored the other talk I referred to, the one by Kelly Turner, and will be co-sponsoring another sometime in spring term. I know that many association members are in attendance today, most of you on Zoom, and to you we say both welcome and thank you. Now just a word about our question format. For those of you who are here live with us, please just raise your hands and we'll take your questions live. For those of you on Zoom, please type your question into the Q&A box on Zoom. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Carolina Reed.
Can I ask here for a second? Thank you so much, Dr. Kravitz. Thank you for inviting me to talk here today. And also a huge thank you to the Center for California Real Estate for sponsoring this. I am not a futurist. I hope I don't disappoint, but I'm really excited to share our project, our California 100 project with you all today. As Dr. Kravitz said, I'm going to be talking about a pretty unique research project. This was something that was across lots of different domains. It was run out of the Goldman School at UC Berkeley. It's known as California 100. And the prompt for the research teams that were being asked to work on the different issue areas was, what will California look like in the next 100 years? And what is the set of policies that will lead to different kinds of futures? So what different scenarios might we imagine if we think about housing and community development 100 years from now? I actually didn't lead the project. I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this, and it was really a team effort. Shane Phillips at UCLA was the lead principal investigator on this project. And then we also had Dana Cuff and Kenny Wong from UCLA City Lab working on this. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you just a little bit of an overview, a little bit of some of the facts that I think shape California's housing market that we need to understand. I'm going to touch really briefly on some of these origins that we need to understand. And then I'm going to talk about the policy. So that's sort of the plan for my talk today. So I'm going to spend less time today about the origins. The affordability crisis in California has multiple causes. It's not just one thing, and it really has been decades in the making. We can go back all the way to 1970, and journal articles, or newspaper articles were saying, California has a housing crisis, right? It's not necessarily new. I like to say it has reached epic proportions. It is really different from what it was 30 or 40 years ago. But just quickly to orient ourselves, to sort of ground ourselves in this historical progression to where we are. Certainly, we have to think about the period after World War II, when we saw a massive expansion of housing in California, but we saw it in very unequal ways. We saw suburban growth, while we saw a pattern of disinvestment in urban areas. We saw urban renewal, which decimated a lot of vibrant neighborhoods of color and often left those neighborhoods empty for decades. We saw redlining, which was denying access to credit in many neighborhoods, particularly neighborhoods of color and neighborhoods with a lot of apartment buildings. Racial covenants that limited the ability of various people to move into other types of neighborhoods, and other discriminatory real estate practices. The 1970s to 1990s were a pretty turbulent period of time in California's history. We see Proposition 13 pass, which created incentives for jurisdictions to prioritize commercial over housing development. We saw cities create stricter and stricter controls over residential development, slowing down the supply of housing and increasing costs of production. And we saw CEQA, which was a really important law for protecting environmental areas across the state and also leading to opportunities for community engagement processes. But we also saw it increasingly misused to halt new development. 2000s to 2010 were equally, or 2020, I guess. And now, gosh, this was even before the pandemic. Think about the pandemic is also a turbulent time. But we saw the dissolution of redevelopment agencies. These agencies provided really important funding for affordable housing. We saw the foreclosure crisis and the financial impacts of that foreclosure crisis on property owners. And we've seen rising inequality and an hourglass labor market. All of these things underlie California's current housing affordability crisis. So what's going on, right? First, we see a divergence. We see a widening of the gap between median household incomes, which is the blue line, and house prices, which is the orange line. Overall, house prices have greatly outpaced wage gains at the median. You can see the effects of the foreclosure crisis there, right? You can see the uptick during the subprime boom, followed by a downturn after the foreclosure crisis hit. Since that time, prices have really rebounded. You can see them going back up pretty substantially. And I think quite surprisingly for many of us who work in housing markets, they continued to rise during COVID. We would have anticipated those prices to go down, but shifts in people's purchasing patterns, shifts in people's living patterns, the lack of supply that was on the market during that time period led to increased prices even during what was a pretty hard impact on the labor market and on people's income. The volatility has led to some fundamental shifts in our housing market. One is that we have, since the foreclosure crisis, really seen a shift towards renting. More households are renting, and more higher income households who would have traditionally moved into homeownership are remaining renters for a longer period of time. And so this is putting increasing pressure on the rental market, right? We have more rental demand than we have rental units, which is part of what is helping or what is contributing to these rising rental costs. We've seen really fundamental shifts in the single family market as well, and particularly the rise of institutional investors purchasing foreclosed single family homes and running those homes as rentals. That's something that didn't occur as frequently before the foreclosure crisis and has implications for renters in those homes. The single family market is a different type of market than the multifamily market. And we've seen a real erosion of homeownership, particularly for Black households, which has led to a widening racial wealth gap. Another key fact that is shaping California's affordability crisis, another thing that we have to keep in mind, is that we've made a series of policy choices over the years where we subsidize homeowners to a much greater extent than we subsidize renters. This is federal housing expenditures in billions towards homeowners versus renters. A lot of that for homeowners is the mortgage interest tax deduction. It has shifted downward actually a little bit since the tax reforms in recent years. But overall, our public spending on homeowners is much higher than our public spending on renters. The other big difference here is that anybody who is a homeowner who has a mortgage and pays interest is eligible for the mortgage interest deduction, right? It's an entitlement. If you pay, you can claim that deduction with some small exceptions. Housing assistance in the United States has never been an entitlement. What do I mean by entitlement? I mean, if you are eligible, you are entitled to receive that assistance. That's how we work with things like SNAP, food stamps. In housing, in California, only about 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 people who is eligible for housing assistance gets it. And so there's an incredible shortage of help for low-income families who need support in paying for their housing costs. The next thing I want to talk about is zoning. And we're going to come back to zoning in a minute because it's so important. But one of the key factors shaping California's affordability crisis is land use and zoning policies. I'm going to come back to legislative reforms in California that relate to zoning and land use when I talk about policies. But the vast majority of cities have zoned their land primarily for single-family homes. And this chart is a little bit confusing, but in the Turner Land Use Survey, which was completed in 2017, almost 90% of cities said that the majority of, or almost all of their land was zoned exclusively for single-family homes. And that apartment buildings were allowed only on a small share or almost none of their land area. I think Dr. Kravitz said this earlier, but continued NIMBYism and resistance to new housing, especially affordable housing and housing for people experiencing homelessness, continues to shape the amount and type of new housing that gets built, as well as the costs. These costs in California are incredibly high. California is now the most expensive place to build in the nation. In 2019, a unit of affordable housing cost about $650,000. I'm sorry, $500,000. I'm looking at the wrong axis. Should have done that better. The average affordable housing unit in 2019 cost about $500,000 to build, or about $700 a square foot. Costs have only increased since then. The combination of supply chain issues and inflation have led the cost of development to rise even further. In coastal areas, it is now costing somewhere between $900,000 and $1 million per unit of new affordable housing. It's about the same on the market rate side. We just have somewhat better data for the affordable housing side, but it is very, very expensive to build. Some of these costs are out of control of California or local jurisdictions, right? Some of these have to do with material costs. Some of them have to do with the cost of capital, but they also are a product of policies that we have made both at the state and at the local level, including California has some of the highest impact fees in the country. Entitlement delays can really drive up costs, especially the uncertainty around development can really drive up costs. Building and design codes also all impact this cost of construction. All of these factors have converged, leading to an underproduction of housing across the state. And I could have showed you lots of different slides, lots of different metrics about how California underproduces housing in relation to demand. I think this one is actually really important because it shows in the last regional housing needs allocation cycle. So this is not the current housing sort of planning cycle that we're currently in, but in the last one, that across the state, cities have not built as much housing as they were asked to plan for under the RHNA process. The RHNA process was critiqued for not actually providing the right amount of units that we actually need. It was known to be an underestimate of actually how much new housing that we would need in all these different cities. And the process or the procedure, the methodology for calculating those numbers have been updated more recently. But what I really want to, the point I really want to make here is that when we look at cities across the state, very few were able to produce even the more modest targets from the past cycle. And when they were able to produce units, it was largely for people earning or households earning above 120% of area median income. Right? When we do produce housing, it tends to be that more expensive luxury housing, and in part that's due to the high construction costs, right? If it costs more to build, it's going to cost more to sell. So what are the implications of this? So let's talk a little bit about what this means, what the housing affordability crisis has resulted in, before we talk about the policies to fix it. The first is that these high costs of housing are leading to unsustainable rental cost burdens, especially for lower income households. About 80% of low income households, these are households that earn under 80% of the area median income, are cost burdened, which means that they're spending more than 30% of their monthly income on their housing costs or on their rent. We are also seeing these cost burdens move up the income ladder. So historically, it has been low-income families that have struggled most with paying rent or paying for housing costs. Over time, we are seeing an increasing number of middle-income families. Those are families that are making between 80 and 120% of AMI really struggle with paying for housing. These rising rent burdens and lack of housing affordability are leading and contributing to California's homelessness crisis. It has gone up steadily over time. California has the largest unsheltered homeless population in the country. More than 150,000 people across the state are experiencing homelessness on any one given night. And although the pandemic delayed the point in time counts, which is where we understand or where we get data from understanding how many people are experiencing homelessness, the 2022 data that has been released so far suggests that all of these numbers in most cities have gone up. The causes of homelessness are complex, particularly at the individual level. There's a lot of factors that come together to help to explain why somebody becomes or experiences homelessness versus somebody who doesn't. But research has consistently shown that the lack of affordable housing and rental cost burdens are primary contributors to these high rates of homelessness across our state. Some other things that we see that are troubling, even before the pandemic, we saw an outmigration of low and middle income households from the state. So the blue bar here is 2010 to 2014, the orange bar is 2015 to 2019. You can see that we saw a net loss of lower income and middle income households moving to other cheaper locations, and a slight increase in higher income households. This has implications for our labor force, it has implications for our labor market and our economic productivity as a state. I mentioned this at the very beginning, but the foreclosure crisis and the changes in the housing market since the foreclosure crisis have only widened racial inequality, and racial inequality in housing outcomes remains profound. In California today, only about 36% of Black households own their homes, compared to 63% of non-Hispanic white households. Eviction rates, and this was before the eviction moratoria, which had an impact on evictions overall, but overall eviction rates are approximately twice as high for Black and Hispanic renters as for non-Hispanic white renters. And approximately 30% of individuals experiencing homelessness on a given night are Black, even though they only make up 6% of the state's population. Two more implications, and then we'll get to these great future policies. First, right, we have to solve the jobs housing balance if we want to tackle climate change. Climate change is the most existential threat to the planet, to our lives, to our well-being. And vehicle miles traveled, the amount of time people spend in their cars, the amount of time people spend commuting really influences our ability to meet the state's very ambitious greenhouse gas targets. Now, I often hear, well, the pandemic changed things, right? The pandemic made it so that everybody can work remotely. These links between commuting aren't as important anymore. I just want to emphasize that for the people for whom the jobs housing balance matters the most, so lower income, moderate income families, they do not have the ability to work remotely, right? The percent that work from home by income, you can see here on the graph, it is very, very low for people who make under $100,000. So the idea that working from home is our solution to reducing vehicle miles traveled, to solving this jobs housing imbalance that we have in California, I think is unrealistic. And then finally, right, we have seen intensification of wildfires. We've seen an increased risk and loss of homes from these wildfires over time. And we are increasingly and continuing to build in this wildland urban interface, which means that those structures are going to stay and remain vulnerable to intensification of wildfires. All right, so what does this all mean for policy? What does this mean for the future? What does this mean for the future of housing in California? I'm often asked, what is going to solve the affordability crisis? What's going to solve the homelessness crisis? And that was, I think, a little bit the prompt from California 100, right? How do we get to a more progressive, a better future without this kind of crisis? I am very sad to report that there is no silver bullet. I am not going to give you the answer in the next 10 or 15 minutes. If I had the answer, I would just do it, right? I wouldn't research it. And Don Turner, who I have the honor of being the Turner Professor and working at the Turner Center, used to say, if it was easy, somebody else would have already done it, right? This is a complicated, complex problem that's going to need solutions at lots of different scales. I've got a few here. I'm sure that they're not all the dimensions that matter, but I want to talk and take each of these in turn for just a second. The first is structural racism. This impacts all systems, from housing and labor markets, educational opportunities, police violence and interactions with the criminal justice system, exposure to environmental harms. This is such a fundamental part of how our housing market works. We have to grapple with it in our future policies. The other is income inequality. I think when we think about housing, we often think about housing and housing costs, but housing affordability is a function of incomes and housing costs. And one of the things that we have seen pretty consistently across the United States, but particularly in California's coastal markets, is a widening income inequality, a widening income gap. And we're seeing disproportionate pay for certain types of jobs and workers, and an erosion of the social contract for others. So a significant share in the Bay Area of extremely low income families. So these are the families that are most vulnerable to housing insecurity and homelessness. About 40% of those work in jobs that pay less than $18,000 a year, right? These are working families who cannot afford to live in California. Lack of a sufficient safety net or insufficient public subsidy. As I mentioned, we have not invested in rental assistance in any kind of way. We could, as a country, choose to make housing assistance an entitlement. And this is where it gets pretty complicated. I'm 100% for housing assistance as an entitlement. But if we impose or if we have that kind of resource in a supply constrained environment like California, it is not going to solve our problem. Already, a lot of people who have housing vouchers can't find units to rent because there isn't enough supply. If we were to expand how much each of those vouchers is worth, they might be able to find more units, but then those costs of providing those vouchers are going to become unsustainable over time. Our housing assistance strategy has to be coupled with a housing supply strategy. Otherwise, it's not going to be a sustainable fix. Zoning and land use planning. The built environment is durable. When we build a house or an apartment building, it lasts a really, really long time. We need to shift how we plan for and use land. But we also really have to understand that it's going to take a while to see those effects, right? This is not a change that is going to happen overnight. But we need to really focus on that if we want a more sustainable future, both in terms of affordability, but also in terms of our environmental goals. There's also tensions here, right? Increasingly, the state is taking more of a control or making more decisions around land use. What does that mean for local control? What does that mean for community engagement processes? And so whenever we're tackling housing issues, we have to think about and appreciate those tensions between community engagement, local voice, local participation in planning processes, and making sure that those don't eclipse efforts to really expand the supply of housing in the state. There can be unintended consequences. So we think about the cost of development, right? We can think about policies to expand the supply of affordable housing like inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary zoning is a very powerful tool for expanding the share of units that are affordable to low-income families. But if we set those inclusionary zoning rates too high, they will stymie all development, and then we don't get any units. And so we need to understand those trade-offs. We need to understand that balance and make sure that our policies are not leading to unintended consequences along the other dimensions that we care about. And then finally, the housing policy ecosystem has been built up over years. We often take little bites at the apple, make little reforms, or we develop new boutique programs that sort of address one little problem here or there or somewhere else. But we don't have a unified system. And this fragmentation in funding, in political voice, in coordination across agency really thwarts our efforts to come to sustainable solutions. All right, now that I've gotten everybody bummed out, all right, there's some bright spots. And I think in our report actually argues that there's a lot of things that we can build on and a lot of ways we are moving in the right direction. Probably most important is the work that the state legislator has done around land use and planning. Again, land use and planning is sort of the fundamental infrastructure on which housing, where housing is built, what kind of housing is built, who that housing is built for, and where is sort of determined by land use and planning. There are a couple of things that I think are really, really important. Certainly housing element and RHNA reforms that have been undertaken over recent years that are currently part of the current cycle are really, really important. Greater accountability and holding cities accountable to those RHNA targets is also going to make a huge difference. ADU legislation, so that's accessory dwelling units. These are smaller units that people can build on their existing land to provide more housing. I think that is a real bright spot. We started making inroads to making it easier to build ADUs 4 or 5 years ago. Every year, the legislator is making those rules a little bit stronger, those laws a little bit stronger, and we have seen a huge uptick in many cities in ADU production as a result. SB 35 streamlines entitlement, so it makes it easier to get permission to build affordable housing across the state. We are currently at Turner Center doing a study to look at the implementation of SB 35 and how well it's working and for what kinds of housing it is working well and where it's not working well. SB 9 was passed with much fanfare. It allows for lot split. So if you have a single family lot, it allows you to split it and do denser development on those 2 split lots. It is, in effect, an end to single family zoning, right? Every single family lot can now be split into 2, more houses can be built on those lots. Implementation of SB 9 is really gonna matter. We are seeing increasingly cities using other powers in their control, like other zoning code laws, to limit the effectiveness and limit the ability of people to use SB 9 to build more supply. And then most recently, AB 211, 2011, it enacts a streamlined approval process for multifamily projects on commercially zoned land. This also has real potential to expand the buildable land in California. The other bright spot is that the state has made real commitments to providing more housing assistance and more funding for programs that address homelessness. Prior to 2018, the state budget actually didn't even have many lines for people experiencing homelessness. There weren't very many programs. And we see in recent years a rapid expansion in funding for addressing homelessness across a large range of programs. We also see some really interesting innovation happening. The building above in the picture on the left is 833 Bryant. It was built in San Francisco. It was built entirely out of modular units. And it brought those units down to about $400,000 a unit. And they were built significantly faster than a traditional affordable housing project can get built. And then below you see a modular non-congregate approach to providing temporary shelter for people experiencing homelessness. Cities are increasingly looking to these kinds of models to help address the unsheltered homelessness population, but also giving people private spaces as opposed to the big shelter rooms that were very common before COVID-19. So lots of bright spots there. I will also say we learned a lot in COVID-19 about the value of rental assistance and about the value of a child tax credit. When we give people more money, they use that money for good things. They use it to pay the rent, they use it to buy groceries, they use it to invest in their kids' education. And we have a very strong evidence base now about the importance of providing a social safety net for families. And so I am hopeful that that's going to lead to a greater expansion of maybe it's guaranteed income, maybe it's a renter's tax credit, which I'd be happy to talk about. I love the idea of a renter's tax credit to sort of support families and households who need it. I'm going to end with some headwinds and then looking forward to everybody's questions. One is for low-income families in California, we are going to have to expand the supply of affordable housing. Market rate housing, so housing that is being built by the market without any kind of public subsidy, is not going to be inexpensive enough for a low-income family to afford. Which means that we need more funding both for capital, right, to build the buildings, and for long-term assistance to ensure that those buildings are well maintained and that we don't run into the same problem as we did with public housing, where we invested in the buildings, but we didn't spend enough money over time to make sure that those buildings were healthy places to live. California is running into a real problem in that we have a lot of affordable housing projects that are ready to be built. They've been entitled, they have their architectural drawings, they are shovel ready. They are ready to be built, and we just don't have enough financing, not enough funding to actually get them off the ground. The chart here shows you the low-income housing tax credit applications. That's the most important source of funding for the new construction of affordable housing. And you can see over time the degree of number of projects that are not funded just because of lack of sufficient subsidy. Rising development costs are part of this, right? Every unit that is more expensive to build means you need more public subsidy. And then again, these operating funds particularly for units for people who are experiencing homelessness, is one of the biggest constraints in terms of our ability to address the homelessness crisis. What are some other headwinds that I think we need to think about when we're thinking about California futures? What's happening at the federal level? I don't know about any of you, but I stayed up way too late last night looking at election returns, right? Wondering what's going to happen with the House and the Senate. I will say the fact that we were not able to pass Build Back Better, which would have actually made the child tax credit permanent, as well as expanded significantly the amount of housing assistance coming to California, makes me concerned that we are not at the federal level going to be able to direct the resources that California needs to address its affordability crisis. But I think that's an open question, right? What's going to happen there? Inflation, the overall labor market, whether or not we go into a recession, all of that's going to have a huge impact on the housing market and our ability to address the housing affordability crisis. Rising interest rates are certainly have an impact on the homeownership market and who is able to buy a house. And so thinking about those as part of our sort of future trajectories. And then California 100, we started it pre-COVID. COVID has had a fundamental impact on both housing and labor markets, and it's not really clear how that's going to influence things going forward. So what did we come up with in this California 100? We really struggled with what's going to shape this future. And we ultimately decided that there were two important axes that are really going to determine where we go. The first axis is whether or not we decide to produce a lot of new housing, or whether we continue on our current path where we continually undersupply how much housing is built in the state. The second axis that we considered in developing our scenarios was to what extent are we going to rely on a framework where housing is really seen as an opportunity for private gain, an opportunity to become rich, right? That can be at the investor level, or it can be at the personal homeowner level. To what extent are we really using housing as a commodity to gain wealth? Versus to what extent do we see housing as a public good and an important dimension for social equity? And how do we balance those two dimensions? Came up with 4 different alternative places we could land depending on whether or not we produce housing but don't consider social equity, or don't produce housing and don't consider social equity, or we consider social equity but we don't increase the supply, right? So we tried to think about like where would we go if we toggled those 2 dimensions in different ways. And we didn't really come to a very good answer as to which one we think is the most likely. We came up with a very strong belief among our research team and among people we interviewed for this project that the goal is the housing for all quadrant, where we're reviving the California dream, where we are both investing in supply, expanding supply, making sure that there is sufficient supply to meet California's population needs, but that we are also thinking continually about how to do that in ways that promote both social equity and environmental sustainability. I'm going to stop there. I welcome you to look at the full report. There are beautiful drawings that sort of illustrate each of the different scenarios and provide you more details about the policy mixes that would lead to different scenarios. Again, I think that sort of combination of both a supply response and a housing assistance response is probably our best pathway, but it's going to take real political will, and it's going to need to take all of us to say yes to housing in our communities. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Reed, for that fantastic talk today. And so we are going to go ahead and I'm just going to give Brooke just a minute to go ahead and stop the recording, and we'll go ahead and move on to